For the last century and a half, China has faced many challenges and crises, international and domestic. But throughout it all, there's been a fundamental intellectual question about how China should relate to the world and how government should relate to the population. One of the roles of intellectuals has been to think about these questions and to think about the implications of the various answers that could be given for China's history, for the Chinese government, for the Chinese people. Today, we have a chance to probe these issues with one of the leading intellectuals in China. For the past 2 years, Harvard has been offering a course on contemporary intellectual debate in China, particularly since the events of 1989. That was designed by Yuwen and by me. My name is Peter Bol. And this year, I was joined in teaching that course by Wang Hui. Wang Hui has been a visiting professor this year in the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations and a Harvard Yenching Scholar. He's professor of history and literature at Tsinghua University in China and director of the Tsinghua Institute for Advanced Study in the Humanities and Social Sciences. He is a man of extraordinary breadth with interest in literature, in history, intellectual history, social theory, politics, and economics. We'll include a full biography of his works that you can download at the end of this interview. Now, Wang Hui, in teaching with you, one of the things I've recognized is that you have unusual breadth of interests and you have a considerable depth of knowledge and rather detailed knowledge of both political and intellectual events of recent times. And we've not spoken really about the world before our course begins in the late 1980s. And in ChinaX, although we have considerable coverage of China's intellectual history, and we have a little bit of mention of the evidential learning movement of the Qing Dynasty, we actually have very little on contemporary intellectual history. And so I thought this would be a really good opportunity to talk with you and to fill in that part of that course, as well as making this available through other media as well. Now, it seems to me that of all the things we could talk about, the one that I would really like us to focus on is your book called The Rise of Modern Chinese Thought, or 现代中国思想的兴起. Because I think it's an extraordinary work. And I think what makes it extraordinary for me is that if I look at people who do contemporary history, very few of them go back into earlier times. Now, Yuwen, who's writing a dissertation at Harvard, has a dissertation that begins in the 17th century and moves to the present. That's fairly unusual. But your work actually goes further back than that. You go back 1,000 years to the Sung Dynasty and Neo-Confucianism to try to talk about modern Chinese intellectual history, modern Chinese thought. So that's really what I hope we'll focus on today. And what I'd like to ask you is, why did you undertake this project? You produced 4 volumes, right?
Yes.
Going back 1,000 years. Why did you undertake the project?
I think the mainly 2 reasons, put simply. One is that my own intellectual turning, I mean, certain kind of the change in my intellectual life. After the end of the 1980s, I decided to turn to the intellectual history. So before that, I was trained as a literary historian, and afterwards, more moved to the intellectual historian. There were some reasons, because when I study Lu Xun, and I have to study like Zhang Taiyan, Liang Jichao, Kang Yewei, Yan Fu, all those people, what he thought his teacher. So I have to find the connections, the influence on him, and then my interest shifted to the later.
So this is Lu Xun in the early 20th century, looking
Yes.
back to people who first made their reputations at the end of the 19th century.
Yes, right. That's the one of the reasons. Second, I think that after 1989, the intellectual atmosphere transformed too, because basically in the 1980s, most of the intellectuals was so much interested in importing Western ideas and theories, different kind of the ideas of theories. I was also enthusiastic for that. We're reading like Heidegger, Nietzsche, or the Max Weber, or something else, those different theories. But after the failure of the student and the intellectual movements in 1989, a lot of the intellectuals began to think the reason how to explain the failure of the movements. So we thought that failure was our own failure, and we tried to think about what's wrong with ourself. And one of the reasons maybe we try to rethink about the intellectual movements in the 1980s. We deeply involving our political cultural identity was shaped by that time. So we thought that one of the reasons by the 1989, before the 1989, it was thought that China already integrated into the whole world. It seemed that we are living in unprecedented time, that it's so open, actually, that there was so many discussions. Now, even now, still people became nostalgic for the 1980s. But I'm not that nostalgic, because I thought there were some internal crises within the 1980s already. That's almost the same for me, that the failure, how to explain the failure of the new cultural movement in May 4th. So the intellectual movements in the 1980s not only interrupted by the political incident, but certain kind of internal reasons from intellectual perspective.
Looking back to the May 4th of 1919,
yes,
and seeing that movement fail,
yes,
you thought the same dynamics were present in 1989.
Certain kind of repetition, certain kind of the repetition between the 1980s and the 1919. That at the moment we can see the similarities or the repetitions there. So one of the explanation, not only for me, but some of my friends surrounding us, that we thought that it seemed that our generation had was the result of the rupture from our past. So that's why it for us it was necessary to reconstruct our connection with our own tradition and the past. That became urgent and necessary to understand the reality about and ourselves. So that's why in the 1990 we began to plan the project of the scholar, the Xueren.
The journal.
Yeah, the journal Xueren. I together with a group of the scholars of my generation. Some were old generation. If you read that journal, it's obviously one of the, it's diverse, but basic backgrounds was trying to go back to the history, to reinterpret modern history and early history. The certain kind of political motivation was trying to have a background for the reflection, or the supporting background for the reflection on the contemporary issues, but not directly move in to the direct discussion on the political economic issues, but try to do something more intellectual historical studies. And that was, I think, the certain kind of the trends. Some people like me focus on the intellectual history. Some people will focus on the 学术史, like Chen Pingyuan.
The history of scholarship.
History of scholarship. So both trying to, there was the overlaps and the differences, that trying to reconnect ourselves to our past, to improve the gap between, it's like, I mean, in the end of the 20th century and the pre-20th century. That was thought as we are the result of the 20th century. We need to improve that, the gap. So that was I think the motivation.
So did you have a question?
No.
Let me begin with the question, why did you begin in the Song Dynasty?
Yeah, that was, I think, the long story, the process, because the book I eventually published in 2004 as the form of 4 volumes. But actually, I started from the later volumes rather than from the beginning. Because that the book was, I wrote that book for, I think, for 13 years. I finished the book in almost 13 years. It takes a long time. That from the 1990 down to the 2003, and that got published in the 2004. So that's very long term. So at the beginning, I focused on the later Qing and the Mayforce period. I tried to understand. I wrote something. Afterwards, some chapters were not included in the 4 volumes. That later books, I talk about the Mayforce period. I didn't include it in that 4 volumes. I go back to the later Qing period. And but interestingly enough, when I work on like the Yan Fu and Zhang Taiyan, Kang Youwei, Liang Jichao, and as well as Wu Zhihui and all those peoples, at the beginning I was influenced by Mayforce idea, like science, democracy, and so on and so forth. But later, when I read these 19th century, the figures in the late 19th century, early 20th century, I found that the whole idea was so complicated. And they had different connections. They're, of course, influenced by Western ideas, but on the other hand, they have very deep roots in their own tradition. And their arguments each other can be traced back to their own different traditions in the long Chinese history. So that's why I feel I stopped. I actually, for certain people, I need to think about that, how to deal with these issues. So at the beginning, I wrote down some chapters on like Yan Fu and his translation, Huxley, John Stuart Mill, and some other like Junks and so on and so forth. And also trying to find the way how he developed his strategy for the translation. Is even from perspective like Zhang Taiyan, he thought that Yan Fu was not a profound thinker. His knowledge about tradition was superficial. However, even for Yan Fu, if you read his translation, you have to know more about the change of books, Shi Ji, and all those long, and the Lao Tzu, and so on and so forth. So that was the beginning. I tried to think about these issues.
So you were drawn back into earlier periods by reading them, not because you intended to.
Yes, at the beginning was not.
Right.
So, and because of these, I developed when I did the work on the Kang Youwei, I had to working on like Jingwen Jingxue, the new text classics. Classics. And to work on the Zhang Taiyan, I have to do some philology work and even the Buddhism and so on and so forth. And on the Yan Fu, I have to do some the Book of Change or some others. And then when I work on the Liang Jichao, one of the chapter was about the Mozi and some others. So that I had to work on these people. But then when I work on these the singular figures and reading their texts, that was a massive reading time for me. I almost read all their books. But then I need a kind of rethink about the framework. And what's the reason for me to do these kind of work so deeply involving the trace back to their own intellectual tradition? Obviously, one of the issues was about the reconsideration of the so-called modernity. What is modern for us? So that was how to deal with, like today I talk about the 20th century. And I began to develop the new ideas about the rethinking the mainstream of the narratives of the Chinese history. At that time, I also did some work on the Liang Shuming, for example. He's thinking about Chinese history, as well as I paid a lot of attention to the so-called local history here, the turn to the Chinese internal perspectives, and so on and so forth. Almost at the same time that I encountered with a group of scholars, different scholars here and there. And one of the figures, I think it was Mizoguchi Yuzo.
The Japanese scholar.
Japanese scholar. He came to, he came to Beijing in 1991. He read my early piece that it's talk about the science, the concept, the idea of science. It's a very long essay, basically traced back to the later Qing and deal with those people like Hu Shi, Yan Fu, and so on and so forth. But obviously, I try to argue that what's the connection between the scientific outlook and the Confucian idea of the Tianli, and their idea of investigating things and achieving the knowledge and so on and so forth, 格物致知, and so on and so forth. And trying to see the connections, what's the rupture, what's the overlaps between these two words. And that trying to do this was one of the efforts to break through the idea that created by the Mayforth generation. Because the Mayforth generation thought that we use the idea of science to attack the whole old traditional forms. But structurally speaking, you found certain kind of the overlaps. And then you found that from Song and Ming, a lot of the ideas about the the investigating things to develop, and the methodology, methodological thinking, and so on and so forth. When the Mizoguchi, I remember that when Mizoguchi Yuzo came to Beijing, before he came, he read my long essay, actually. He was interested. So that's why after his arrival, he asked some friends, Japanese friends, to make the arrangements for meeting with me. And I respected him, very old generation scholar. And he made some comments. Later, we published our dialogue in Xueren, the scholar. One of his arguments was that he thought that almost no these kind of the comparison in Japan, that as what I did, because for Japanese scholars, they traced concept by concept, but not talk about the framework, the whole cosmological framework to understand the rise of the new outlook, and also try to trace back the early origins in the Confucianism. He was interested in this. And then he was developing his idea about the comparison between the so-called the Chinese concept of Tian, the heaven, and the Japanese concept of Tian. That was one of his most important the work, and the reevaluation of the Song Confucianism and its impact in China. So that's in Japan. So that gave me some, I think that the implication. Maybe I need to dive into further about the Song Confucianism and the Ming Confucianism. That's why I began to read a lot of the scholarship, as well as the original text in the Song and the Ming texts. And that's why I think that one of the reasons was the encounter with him. And then because my thinking about the so-called the modernity, obviously the dominant idea of the modernity was really the 19th century Europe idea of modernity. But when I read the documents, especially the Japanese, the scholarship on the Song and the Ming history, immediately I found those Japanese scholars was deeply, even the contemporary, the scholars was deeply influenced by the Kyoto School. Though they are reluctant to mention Kyoto School for the political reasons, because Kyoto School was thought as an imperial school. So politically, they don't want to really involve it.
So this Kyoto School is a school in Japanese history that argues that in many ways there's a transition from the Tang Dynasty to the Song, and the Song is beginning of a kind of East Asian modernity. Although I don't think we would agree with that too much anymore, but still we do see a tremendous rupture in Chinese history between the Tang and the Song. And you mentioned this term Tianli, translated sometimes heavenly principle or natural coherence or something like this. And you titled the first volume is called Li, principles and things.
Yes,
Ooh.
right. Yes.
What did you mean by that? What were you getting at?
The question is that it's also started from the questioning about the hypothesis of Tang Song transition, and together with after the Nathan Kunan was Miyazaki Shisada, he talked about the Toyo no Kinsei.
Yeah,
right? That was the Kinsei almost can be translated early modern.
Early modern.
So early modern for me it's interesting topic because the people in the European history, they talk about early modern about the 18th century.
Right,
but he talked about the 10th, 11th century.
11th
Was already the Kinsei. I was a little bit curious about that arguments. However, I disagree with his arguments about the Confucianism because he thought that the Song was a proto-nation state. So that's why the Confucianism, Song Confucianism was sort of kind of the proto-nationalism, the ideology of proto-nationalism. However, obviously, if you read the original texts, those Song scholars had a very critical viewpoint, a lot of the viewpoint about the transition, which means that there were certain tensions between their ideas and the political reality. So it cannot be simply as the derivative from the social change. It was certain kind of critical tension there. So how to understand that critical tension in order to distance my arguments from Kyoto School? So I thought that the issue of Tianli and gradually shaped the whole idea. Of course, the Tianli was not from the beginning was already the dominant idea, the central idea. But by after the Chen Hao, Chen Yi, and down to the Zhu Xi, obviously Tianli occupied a high position in the whole ideas. So I thought that there was a process of the abstraction in the Confucian thinking. So basically, the Confucian thinking was not that abstract. Based, if you read the Confucius, his writing, even the Mengshu's writing, a little bit more. But compared to the idea of Tianli, obviously there was an abstract process. So how to explain that the process of abstraction was, for me, is a historical and a political issue.
Well,
so it's, yeah, please.
I'm sorry, just because we're talking about this section, because I think in your 4 volumes that your definition of Li, and especially your definition of New Confucian tradition and its influence to the entire later Chinese intellectual history plays a very significant role in your argument. So I just want to perhaps talk a little bit more about some important elements that I discovered from your book. So for instance, you talked about that when the New Confucian scholars talk about Tianli, there are at least 2 important issues. One is that they sort of discover a rupture or a tension between an ideal antiquity and the historical reality where they're living. So that creates a kind of sort of drive behind their intellectual life. They want to restore a certain kind of ideal. Second is something that you put there, like a tension between Tianli, universal principle, and Shishi, which is historic.
Propensity of time.
Sure, that sort of notion.
So, or it's a kind of framework that allow people to think about ideal, but not being dogmatic in a way that they could think about their agency in a real historical time. So it seems to me that for you, like these 2 elements are very central to all the Confucian thinking that comes after.
Basically, I think it's because there was a long tradition in the 20th century for the understanding of the Tianli or those New Confucianism in the Song Dynasty. Was dominant arguments was the so-called philosophical breakthrough. They tried to treat the process of the abstraction of ideas as a philosophical breakthrough. So suddenly, only in the Song Dynasty, we had a philosophy. So we
Yeah.
can talk about the cosmology, ontology, or the epistemology, and so on and so forth. So from Feng Yulan, Hu Shi, and all those people developed that idea. But in that sense, in that regards, I actually more, I think our position that I share a lot of your scholarship and your explanation for that from more historical perspective to understand that process, the rise of the Tianli. And the basic argument was, I think that Yuan already mentioned that when came from, is linked together with the consciousness of history. That, for example, like you mentioned that Ouyang Zhu, or the historians, they talk about the 3代以上, 3代以下.
The three dynasties
Three
of antiquity.
dynasty and the pre-dynasty after the age of the three dynasties after that is the demarcation of the periodization. Obviously, which means that that kind of the change of historical change, the consciousness of historical change was helping.
Yeah. So in some sense, I think what you're getting at then is that for people like Zhu Xi, the Neo Confucian thinker, argued that there was a real difference between antiquity of the San Dai and historical dynasties later from Qin Hanan.
Yeah.
Right? There's a fundamental rupture in history.
Right. That's why you cannot simply employ like classical studies in Han and Tang to directly employ the ideas or institutional arrangements directly applied to the Song reality.
Right.
But on the other hand, for the Confucian scholars, they also need the sense of the continuity. We are reconstructed the continuity. That's why the process of the abstraction of ideas serve that. On the one hand, which can inherit the legacy, but on the other hand, not dogmatically employed or apply the old ideas into the reality. So that needs your self-negotiation. That's why the things will become important. Investigating things became the major issue. That's after the Song Dynasty, so many different schools really diversified, focus on the reinterpretation of Ge, right? That's the Ge Zhi and so on.
There's no Neo-Confucian notion of investigating things and extending knowledge.
Extending knowledge, yes,
But that, of course, it makes a very important assumption that things are real.
Yes.
Right? And so we live in a less than ideal world, but somehow by our understanding of it, we can still reach ideals.
Yes, right.
And so that you can transcend your circumstances.
Yeah, that's why I use the title Li Yu Wu, because at the beginning, which started actually from my point of view, the starting point for that kind of thinking was that the things itself cannot it was not self-evident anymore, because the things, the Wu could be certain kind of the rights, you can follow that. But now you need to investigating things to negotiate it with the change of time, to understand some internal logic. That was the Li, right? So the principles inside of that. But that was the thing, the Li was not self-evident.
That's true.
It's always you need to think about that. Think through things. Of course, later were the diversified, the different understanding on the things itself. So that's why I try to historicize that the issue of the abstraction, not treat that only as a philosophical breakthrough, but try to understand that it was a historical, political, and a social transformation process.
So there's one thing, like particularly that I think it's interesting because the tension you point out between universality and the historical experience also have a big influence on how contemporary Chinese thinkers think, because the kind of tension they find themselves in, as you point out in the book, is sort of between sort of kind of search of universal modernity and how to define like who we are, where we are in this historical time. And so this kind of tension between what you mentioned as kind of searching for capitalism or modernity or nation state, and like how to really situate Chinese history in this framework of defined by the West, a framework of modernity.
Yes, and also that process was generated a critical tension, I think, between the Confucian scholars and their reality. So their critique of the land system, the critique of the examination system, the critique of the centralization system. So all these were not simply followed the political economic change.
I think you're right. In some sense, you see in the Song, you're then seeing the advent of intellectuals who have a critical and reflective stance vis-a-vis political power.
Yes, right.
Now, the second volume, I'm going to move on to the second volume.
Yes.
And it has a very intriguing title. It says Empire and State. 帝国与国家.
Yes.
What did you mean by that? I mean,
okay. This is interesting. The issue for me, that the second volume actually focused on the Qing.
On the Qing dynasty.
And basically, there were two things happened. The one, from intellectual history perspective, the transformation of methodology in Confucianism. Of course, there was continuous. There was still the Li Xue was continued to be existed in the Qing dynasty, but basically, dominant the trend was the classical studies,
the evidential learning.
Yes, right. Yeah. This is the first transformation. Second was that it's also I try to question the teleology of the narrative of modernity, because if according to the Nathan Kunan or the Miyazaki Shisada, if the Song can be thought as the early modern, the Qing, that the how to deal with the Qing, or the how to deal with the Yuan, the Mongolian dynasty, was that there was the early modern, then back to the medieval age, and again the early modern, and back to the medieval age. I think that was the difficulties that they tried to create a linear development of the history based on a concept of the modernity, capitalism, and so on and so forth. So that was I studied, and also obviously that was a question of the whole, not only about the Kyoto School, but the whole narrative of modernity in the Western, the historiography, to think about the issues. So that's why the basic issue, one of the basic issues for me was that how to deal with the rupture and the continuity between Song and the Yuan, how to deal with the rupture and the continuity between Ming and the Qing, especially how to deal with the continuity and the rupture between the Qing and the Republic. And all these issues emerged following that. So basically, those people, I think, like Miyazaki Ishisada, he knows that the difficulty. For example, he said that when he talked about the Mongolian Empire, he talked about the social life. For example, why in the Yuan dynasty, the ruler didn't fail to publish a legal code. It's at the beginning they used the Taihe legal code. Then they moved to some others.
So they first used the Jin dynasty,
yes,
which
the
they
Jin
had
dynasty.
conquered in
yes,
1234. Right. Use their legal code, but they don't issue a legal code themselves.
Right. So basically his argument was that after the Song dynasty, even that were conquered by the Mongolian, but the social life will continue. In order to maintain his arguments, coherence of his arguments about the early modern in East Asia. So, but obviously it's fair to interpret that the multi-ethnic empire, the Mongolian, different style, the political culture and others, was so these was one of the arguments. Qing was even more serious, the issue, because basically the 20th century modern China was based on the territory composition of population. A lot of the institutional arrangements was also inherited from the Qing dynasty, including the sovereignty issue was really that they even arranged the Qing emperor issued the edict to retrieve that. So how to deal with these issues?
And it's interesting because both the Mongol Empire, even just the Yuan part of it, the mainly China part of it, and the Qing Dynasty are multi-ethnic.
Yes, right.
Right? And multi-ethnic empires don't seem to fit the notion of a nation state that's defined by ethnicity or shared language.
Yes.
But here's the problem that I have in part with thinking that this is a sustainable model. All of these peoples, let's say Tibetans, Manchus, Mongols, Uyghurs, all have their own histories.
Yes, right.
Their own writing.
Yes.
Right? Their own political histories, right? Their own states in the past.
Yes, right.
So how within what's now we call a Chinese context, the modern Chinese context, how does this Qing model, how does this work out?
I think that's why we need go back to the long cultural tradition, especially I think reinterpret the Confucianism in that context too, because the methodological shift from Songming, the Confucianism, to the Qing Confucianism was mainly, I think, that from the Li-Xue, that's a more philosophical thinking, to the historical and the textual readings, were kind of on the one hand, we can talk about many people talk about the so-called intellectualism or the sort of pursuit of knowledge. But on the other hand, the reading the traditional texts or focus on the re-narration of the history was always linked to the legitimation of the new polities. So that was, I think, it's very important. I thought that the classical studies was also functioned in that way to some extent. They do geographical studies, for example. They do the linguistic studies. They do a lot of the studies trace back to the boundary and the so-called ethnographical studies and so on and so forth through these historical studies. But that still was put into the framework of the Confucianism. So here I try to understand that the why, for example, actually not only the new text school but also the older text school, they want to treat reformulate the issue, try to raise the more flexible relationship between the so-called Yi and the Xia, the barbarian and the Chinese, or something like that.
Well, we would say the tribal peoples.
Yeah, tribal.
And the central country peoples.
Basically, those, if we familiar with the Song Confucianism, especially in the Southern Song, was very strong arguments for the demarcation between Yi and the Xia.
Except it seems to me that what Neo-Confucian universalism, right?
Yeah.
Says that all people, all things are endowed with Tianli.
Yes, right. That's true.
So, although they could culturally make a distinction, they have to acknowledge non-Chinese peoples as equally being people.
Yeah, that's why the Qing Dynasty didn't give up the Song Confucianism. Still, the Song Confucian universalism was thought as the official ideology. But however, most of the scholars move into the very concrete studies for these and that.
Yeah, but you mentioned in the book, especially when you focus on Jingwen Jingxue, I was actually interested in this issue, why you were particularly interested in Jingwen Jingxue, because at the same time, there were different groups doing very different things.
Yes.
So I think that your interest, it's my interpretation, that your interest in Jingwen Jingxue has much to do with also your interest in the empire.
Yes, right.
The kind of institutional building of empire under the Manchu rulership.
Yeah.
And you see that on one hand, there's a scholarship trying to marginalize a certain kind of earlier division or radical division between the Chinese and the Bavarians.
Yes, right.
So you think that the Jingwen tradition actually trying to push that aside, instead trying to emphasize that actually an empire, like
Yes.
later Kang Youwei would pick it up, like
Yes, right.
empire,
Yes, right.
that what we call 中国,
Yes, right.
shouldn't be limited or bound by the particular language or cultural or custom.
Yes.
Instead, it should cover the minority groups and to pay attention to their own cultural and political autonomy to an extent in order to let them live peacefully.
Yeah. I actually had, in the book, there was a chapter on Guyanwu.
Right.
That's the last chapter of the volume 1. That already I talk about that because in the early Qing, that in the later Qing they treated Guyanwu, and those was the classic text for the older text schools, but they not claim that as an old text school, but treat back to, but inside that both Guyanwu and Huang Zongxi, in different ways, they try to build up the whole totality. I mean, the whole totality of the long Chinese tradition for the negation of the current regime. There was certain kind of the rejection. That was the very strong rejection. Yep. Only in the Qianjia time that the certain kind of depoliticized.
And the Qianjia time being the 18th century.
Yes, 18th century after the Qianlong, and the whole legitimacy of the Qing was much more consolidated. So that was these kind of the political tensions were gradually relaxed. And that's also the time when the Zhuang Chenyu and those people emerged in that trend. In the view of the historical scholarship, not so much difference, but the basic arguments between that new text scholarship and the older text the scholarship in that moment were at the beginning. However, of course, that was also, I had some subtle arguments with Ben Elman, Professor. I was in UCLA quite familiar with his book, and we are also familiar with each other. And I learned a lot from him. And his basic argument was that the Zhuang Chenyu, Liu Fenglu, he tried to use that to challenge that the Fairbank's hypothesis of that the impact and the response. But basically thought that the rise of the new text school was nothing to do with the Western impact, right? So only when the Kang Youwei and those people intervened, then the situation changed. For him, that the first argument, I think his precondition, I think, based on several issues. One is that he actually picked up the arguments which quite normal in the history of the scholarship, say that the new text school was abrupted for 1,000 years after the Donghan, East Han were almost disappeared, with the exception of the Yuanming period at the very sheer example, right? So basically no such thing as a new text school after the Donghan. And there was certain revival in the late 18th century. That was the one of the argument. Second argument was that which was nothing to do with the latest the pattern that the Fairbank talked about. They tried to argue from the internal perspective of Chinese history. But then in order to do that, he picked up the arguments from Wei Yuan. He said that because Wei Yuan implied that why Zhuang Chenyu did that book, because he had the political struggle with He Shen, right, in the court. So he talked about the classical studies and the politics. I think that I had some the overlaps, but some different views. First, I think that the arguments about the disappearance of the new text ideas for 1,000 years need to be reconsidered, because it's if you not only observe these phenomena only from the perspective of so-called the history of scholarship. If you look at a lot of the writings and the political treatises in different dynasties, especially the dynasties when they try to argue for the legitimacy, orthodoxy of the new dynasty, like a Mongolian Empire, the Yuan dynasty, a lot of the ideas about the Santong Sanshi were employed for legitimize that. So in that sense, the new text idea will never disappear.
Still lived on.
Living in the political culture, but not as a scholarship. But there was some scholarship, but not seriously. So these were one of the major arguments, was not necessarily we should broaden our perspective to understand that.
So in some sense, when you talk about empire, equal, you're talking about it, I would say, in a positive sense.
To some extent,
to
yes,
some extent,
right.
in a positive
Yes.
sense
Yeah.
of the possibility of a multi-ethnic world.
Yes, right.
Right?
Yeah.
As alternative to the modern nation state.
Yes, right.
To an ethnically defined
Yes,
state.
right.
And yet, it seems to me that since, in many ways, as you've kept saying, this book is also concerned with modernity
Yes,
and
right.
the problems of the present,
Yes.
that possibility of the multi-ethnic
Yes.
is being challenged on
Yes.
all sides,
Yes.
both by Han people
Yes.
and by the national minorities.
Yes, right. But this was only in the process of the consolidation of the nation-state formation. So that was the my reflection on the whole process. It's because all the nations are multi-ethnic in a sense. Even Japan and Korea can be thought as a multi-ethnicity.
Although they don't like to think
they
of themselves
don't
that.
like that. But we showed that how strong the process of the homogenize the whole society into one. So that what I in the volume 2, the Empire Nation State, I try to emphasize that the Confucianism, together with some other political culture, provided a certain kind of more flexible framework, allowed the space for the different interpretation of that relationship.
What's interesting about this, from my perspective, I've looked back to the Yuan and to the Qing, is that they rely heavily on quotas.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes,
And
heavily. Yes, absolutely.
And that, in fact, the challenges of dealing with multi-ethnic worlds,
yes,
multi-ethnic polities,
yes,
are very real, and that's the solutions take place in many cultures.
yes,
right?
right.
They're very
That's true.
similar. Let's move on to the third volume,
Yes,
which you called Gongli
yes.
and Fan Gongli,
Yes,
right?
right.
Gongli is what in English?
The translated as universal principle.
Universal principle,
was
but
in the
different from
translation.
Tianli, right?
Yes, very different.
So it's the title is then Universal Principles and Anti-Universal Principles,
You can argue that
Or-
it is a very difficult
or
to
universalism and
because
particularism.
the Professor Pocock wrote a review on my on the introduction part, the China from Empire to Nation State. He actually one of the part was focused on the Gongli, Fan Gongli, and he thought that for him a little bit difficult to understand the Gongli because is sometimes a universal, sometimes a public, right? The public. And also Tianli is also difficult to translate into English because the heaven immediately in the Christian the context.
But let's go back to this Gongli,
But
Fan Gongli.
basically, the Gongli was shaped by the new idea of science. Basically, if you look at from the later Qing period, those people trying to use the positivism or the positivistic, the logic, to reconstruct our understanding of the cosmos, the reality, and our human being themselves. So different schools, they use the atoms, 以太, or some other term to try to find ultimate the elements of the composition of the cosmos or the world. So rebuild up based on the 19th century version of the physical positivism. So that was the Auguste Comte, Herbert Spencer, and those people, and the introduction of the theory of evolution, introduction of different scientific knowledge will help to build up the cosmos.
So it's almost the contrast between sort of the positivists and the romantics.
Yes.
Right?
They try to use that, for example, Yan Fu was very typical. He used that to criticize the Tianli, right? They criticize the Song Confucianism. They try to treat the Confucianism as so-called the metaphysical.
Right.
So the division between Tianli and the Gongli for that generation was the division between the metaphysical and the scientific.
And the scientific. Well, what was the Fangongli, the opposition to
The
this?
opposition was that mainly methodologically speaking, those people tried to argue that there was no such thing, or even those like Zhang Taiyan was typical. He thought that the evolution, science, or even the idea of nature itself was a subjective creation rather than the objective, the ideas. So he thought that those people, use the hegemony of the scientific ideology, try to dominate the world, reshape the world. But the whole basic idea, you treat that as a basic facts. But that basic facts from his Buddhist view or the Taoist view, he said that was the illusion, because it's a subjective invention rather than the objective facts.
So let me try to see if I can capture this. So on one hand, you have people influenced now by sort of Western social theory.
Yes, right.
Who are saying there are universal laws.
Yes,
there are universal principles.
Yes.
We can understand everything.
Yes.
And culture becomes irrelevant.
Yes, right.
Right? And then you have people who are, in opposing that, are saying, no, your universals are actually historically bounded.
Yes.
They're culturally specific.
Yes, right.
Is that right?
Yes, right.
Okay. So why is that important? Because isn't the story of modernity the story of the rise of this kind of universals?
Yeah, that
and social theory?
Yeah, that gives the possibility of the critique of modernity in the process of in search of modernity. So if we read back to the early the literature in the modern Chinese intellectual history, started from even the masterpiece Ben Schwartz entitled In Search of the Modernity, in search of the wealth and the power. Actually, that was in search of wealth and modernity. All the things were new, modern things were our telos, that China should be adapted to that. But from Zhang Bingling and down to the Lu Xun, they developed the new idea of the critical vision about the modern world, because only with these critique of modernity, that give the possibilities for more concrete critical thoughts about the modern process. Otherwise, for example, when we talk about the imperialism, colonialism, or when the industrialization, how the moral community was disappeared and so on and so forth, all these issues as a sequence of that process of in search of modernity what need to be reflected upon. So that's why what's the difference was for Zhang Bingling and those people, they constructed a cosmological, even an ontological framework for that kind of the reflection, which was really deep.
I think she has some
No,
questions about this.
Yes.
How is my time doing? Oh, good.
Okay. Do you thinking of, in a way, you're also following certain kind of way of thinking, like developed by Zhang Taiyan and Lu Xun?
Maybe.
In comparison to another, more who we often define liberalism in contemporary China,
Yes.
who
They
strives for certain kind of,
They embraced the modernity without any doubts.
or certain
that
kind
was
of interpretation of modernity.
That's why.
different,
That's true. That's
market,
yes.
capitalism,
Yes, right.
relationship.
Even the democracy, even the
yes.
democracy. So different. I actually, of course, the Zhang Taiyan and Lu Xun and those people had an impact, but also, as I said, that we also can trace back to the Confucianism, like a Song Confucianism, how they try to create the idea of Tianli. On the one hand, trying to search for the connection with our past, maintain a certain kind of the telos there. But on the other hand, trying to keep the critical tension with the new developments in their times. That was the very important tension there. That was the critical tension. So I can see something, even between Zhang Taiyan, Lu Xun's tradition, and also the whole, even Liang Jichao and Kang Youwei, they all had these kind of long tradition. They are not embraced all things together. It's without the critique or without the doubts.
Kind of
That you can find that the tradition
dogmatism.
and also the Confucian tradition actually based on that the Confucian himself to talk about the bankrupt of the ritual world. Li Bong Yue Huai. That was the timing. He argued for going back to the archaic time, to resume that the order of the world of the rights. So in that sense, through the whole rupture, I can see something that the certain kind of the spiritual linkage there. So that's why I, from my point of view, that was not only about the contemporary 20th century, but it's about the whole the understanding or the reinterpretation of the Chinese intellectual history that was dated back to maybe Song Confucianism and also the Confucius time, and also the Gu Yanwu and Huang Zongxi and those people. They try to retrieve another methodology in order to empower themselves to confront what's the reality, because all the passion, all the methodology lost its capacity for being for criticized.
So as we come to an end of this interview, it seems to me that one of the things that I hear here from, because you in many ways are one of the most modern of intellectuals, broadly acquainted with Western European thought and American thought, published widely in English, and yet this notion of going back and finding things in the past, for which you've devoted considerable time to, is also something that empowers you.
To some extent, yes.
Right? But I think part of your argument is that it was true for Confucius going back.
Yes.
It was true in the Sung, with the notion that we could go back, right?
Yes.
It's true for Gu Yanwu.
Yes.
It's true again for Zhang Taiyan and Liang Qichao. So that once more in China today, the idea that China has an intellectual history and a cultural and literary history has a history.
Yes.
Right?
Which may also offer an alternative to what has been practiced.
Offers many alternatives, becomes a resource for thinking in the present.
And the future.
And the future. Thank you very, very much.
Thank
This has been a wonderful time.
Thank you.